Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Matrix. My name is Michael Watts. I'm the acting director here at Matrix. And as you may or may not know, Matrix is a sort of portal, in a way, for critical social science research on campus. As the name implies, we're a type of institutional framework that supports particularly critical interdisciplinary social science. And we support a raft of work, actually, of various sorts. And I don't want to spend a lot of time right now pointing to what's coming up this semester. But if I could just flag a couple of things before I introduce our speaker. We have our Author Meets Critic series. We have Stephanie Jones-Rogers, who'll be talking about her book, They Were Her Property, coming up. Brandy Summers and Nikki Jones will be talking about Brandy's new book, Black in Place. Rosemary Joyce, Anthropology, Future of Nuclear Waste, and Steve Weber's book, Block by Block on the Rise of Global Capital. All of these are coming up. We actually have our Matrix on Point series. These are sort of informal discussions, largely with Berkeley faculty on issues of the moment. We have a discussion on the fate of the forest coming up with Nancy Peluso, Chris Lesser. We have one on taxation and the 1%. With Emmanuel Saez, whose book, Triumph of Injustice, you're probably familiar with, been advising Warren, Bernie, among others. We have another on electoral manipulation with Sarah Anzia, Bertrand Ross, and finally one on homelessness, which is going to be led by Thomas Fuller. He's the head of the SF New York Times San Francisco Bureau. Some of you maybe read his astonishing article about homelessness in Oakland earlier in the fall. We've got a Matrix seminar with Adam Tooze from Columbia, who wrote the fantastic, in my view, the best book on the financial crisis called Crashed. He's going to be here in April. We have a couple of lectures. Jack Jackson will be talking about his book, Law Without Future. Alex Gillies will be talking about Crude Intentions, her new book from Oxford University Press. And last but not least, we're going to be having a conference entitled The Rise of the Right, organized by Wendy Brown and Dylan Riley, and co-sponsored by Matrix here, which will have speakers including Achin Van Eyck from India, Andre Singer from Brazil, Eva Ronredeker from Germany, and our own Gillian Hart. And we have a bunch of other things that I won't go through, all of which is to say there's a lot happening. Please check out our website. As I said last semester, the only thing that Matrix really is missing right now is a small film festival. All right, today is our Matrix Distinguished Lecture. It's actually our inaugural Matrix Distinguished Lecture, and this is an occasion to bring to campus a critical social scientist working in an interdisciplinary vein who speaks to an audience on and off campus, which contributes directly to the themes that Matrix is focusing on this semester. Those themes are democracy in crisis, and race, class, and inequality. Those are the two themes. Actually, we'll be having a second distinguished Matrix lecture later with Katharina Pister, who'll be talking about her new book, Code of Capital. She's at the law school in Columbia. So given that focus then, crisis and democracy, race, class, and inequality, it's hard to imagine a more appropriate speaker than Keeanga Yamata Taylor. She's currently assistant professor and Charles McElwain preceptor in the Department of African American Studies at Princeton. And she's going to be talking today about her new book, Race for Profit, published by UNC Press, which incidentally was longlisted for the National Book Award. Central to her research, of course, is housing and the politics of shelter, you might say. And she focuses specifically on the intersection of state policy, race, class, and especially the power of real estate and finance capital. Of course, these are issues that are central to us in the Bay Area. I don't need to tell you this, where eviction, inflated housing and rental costs. I live in San Francisco, 8,000 people living on the streets. All of these things are deeply central to our everyday politics. But it's not obviously just a San Francisco problem. This is as relevant in Berlin as it is in New York, as it is in Barcelona or London. And in fact, housing and housing politics, in my view, have emerged as a major front along which the fight against various forms of neoliberal capitalism and authoritarian populisms are currently being waged. And this is central to Keeanga's work. She was educated at Northeastern Illinois University, got her PhD at Northwestern in 2013, And before she came to Princeton, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She's going to talk about her new book today, but of course you probably know her or may know her for her other books, which are widely known on and off campus, from Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, which incidentally won the Lannan Cultural Freedom Award in 2016, and How We Get Free, Black Feminism and the Combahee River Collective, which won the Lambda Literary Award just over a year ago. These books have been enormously influential on and off campus. They're really now foundational texts in terms of thinking about black politics, movement politics more generally, and the complex histories and genealogies of feminism. These books, of course, point to her long and abiding commitment to activism and to a critical type of public intellectualism. Her writings appeared in the New York Times. You probably saw her op-ed recently, in LA Times, in The Nation, Jacobin, Guardian. And she's an activist of note, not only because she's supporting Bernie, but because she was an organizer, some of you will remember, of the Day Without a Woman March in 2017. She was centrally involved in the inauguration of 2017 and been involved in various of the women's marches. She's an activist and public intellectual in the fullest sense. And I suppose one needs to say that her critical stance with respect to the Trump administration in particular has come with its own burdens, where she's suffered personal threats, invective and abuse from the likes of Fox News and others. All of which is to say, we're delighted that Keeanga could, these are badges of honor, of course, here. We're delighted that she could make time to be here today. We're piggybacking actually off her visit at UC Santa Cruz. And I have to say, Keeanga, that we cannot match that poster that was advertising her event over the last couple of days. At the west gate of Santa Cruz, there is a poster. It's like something out of the Macy Day parades. It's got to be like 40 feet. I'm sorry, we can't match that. I mean, we do our best here. We're struggling with austerity. I'll try better next time. Let me just also a vote of thanks, if I may, before I turn over to Keeanga, to Jessica Stewart and Ava Sato, who's helped organize this, and especially our co-sponsors, Leslie Salzinger, Gender and Women's Studies, and Alison Post of the Global Metropolitan Studies. They've both been enormously supportive of this and other events here. So with no further ado, delight to have Keeanga here. She's going to speak to us today about her book, Race for Profit, How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermined Black Home Ownership. Welcome.
Thank you. How's everyone? I thought there'd be like 15 people here. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks, Michael, for throwing this together. Once you heard that I was going to Santa Cruz, yeah, I'm happy to be here. And let's just get started. I know we don't have a lot of time. I'll talk for about 40 minutes. And then hopefully we can have a provocative discussion. Is this? Okay. So I wrote a book, Race for Profit, How Banks in the Real Estate Industry Undermined Home Ownership. And so this talk is intended to give kind of an overview of the main themes of the book. The book is what I describe as dense but readable. And there are lots of different storylines in the book, but it's covering a relatively condensed period of time from the 1968 Housing and Urban Development Act to the 1974 Community Development, what is it, CDBG? Hopefully I'll come to the name of it by the end of this talk. So it's a tight period of time, but I'm trying to give a general overview of the main themes that I deal with in the book in this talk. Okay, last July, in a now typical spasm of racist vitriol, Donald Trump described the city of Baltimore as a, quote, rat and rodent infested mess that, quote, no human being would want to live in. It was cruel and thinly veiled code invoked to disparage the hardship in black working class communities of that city. In doing so, it also conveyed a fatalistic disregard for those conditions, while expressing a decided lack of ambition to actually attend to something as serious as rodent infestation. Despite Trump's rhetoric, rat infestation in Black, poor, and working class communities is not evidence of African American indifference to conditions in their neighborhoods, but rats have always been markers of substandard housing that thrives in the enclosure of residential segregation. The menace of rats in Black working class neighborhoods in the 1960s also inspired ridicule from mean-spirited white conservatives in government then. It also sparked activism and even uprisings. In August 1967, nearly 2 weeks after riots in Detroit prompted the rare deployment of federal troops in an American city, dozens of demonstrators burst into the chamber of the House of Representatives chanting, "Rats cause riots." Days earlier, Congress had rejected a 2-year, $40 million bill to exterminate rats in inner cities across the United States. The protesters sat in the gallery of the hall for 20 minutes, repeating the slogan, "We want a rat bill." The previous attempt at passing the bill had not merely been voted down, but had been ridiculed in the process. A Virginia Republican mocked the legislation to howls of laughter from other white representatives, saying, quote, "Mr. Speaker, I think the rat smart thing for us to do is vote this rat bill down right now." One of his colleagues mocked it as another civil rights bill. No laughing matter for the people who lived in the inner city. Rats were the most visceral example of the unequal living conditions forced onto Black people in mid-century America. In the 1960s, African American media regularly reported on rat attacks on the most vulnerable members of Black urban households, children. Lorraine McTush, a single African American mother, complained to a Chicago Defender reporter that she stayed up most nights because of rats. The rats crawling in her bed, which made her nervous, and the rats in her children's bed, which terrified her. "They get into the bunk beds, and so I sit up all night. I am miserable and afraid." 2 days before his birthday, Andre Adams was chewed to death by rats while sleeping in his crib, a death so shocking that more than 1,000 African-American activists gathered on Chicago's West Side in protest. One activist recalled the prior summer's deadly riots. "Remember Watts," he screamed. A newspaper report described in grisly detail the infant's remains. Quote, "When he lay in his crib, you could see the holes where the rats had chewed. The little finger of his right hand was tied on with a string." Chicago health officials disagreed, claiming that the child died of malnutrition, but nevertheless conceded that rats had fed on the baby's corpse. Civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King, who spoke at the hastily organized protest, reminded the crowd, "This is why we are fighting the slums in Chicago." The rat infestation in Black neighborhoods was profound. When African American children in a Chicago neighborhood were given a vocabulary test and asked to identify various familiar objects, more than 60% of them misidentified a rat as a teddy bear. In the aftermath of riots in Philadelphia in 1964, a city-commissioned report found that 100% of reported rat bites happened in segregated Black majority neighborhoods. Housing segregation, maintained through a vexing combination of white terroristic violence, public policy, and the exclusionary practices of the private sector, ensured the dilapidated and substandard condition of Black housing. These were the evidence of exclusion and enclosure, and they boiled over into the electricity of successive waves of uprisings across the country in the 1960s. A Harris poll taken in the summer of 1965 after riots in South Central Los Angeles found housing conditions listed among the top 3 concerns of all Americans. In the weeks after the uprising in Detroit in 1967, a Washington Post poll forcefully linked deteriorating conditions in Black communities with the uprisings. Fully 70% of Blacks attributed rioting to housing conditions. 59% of Blacks said they knew someone living in rat-infested housing. 57% of African Americans reported holes in their ceilings. 49% said their housing was overcrowded, and 68% reported cockroaches in their housing. By the end of the 1960s, the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, known as the Kerner Commission, had left no doubt that substandard housing, evidenced by rat infestation, was a recurring factor in the annual bouts of riots that roiled American cities. Identifying segregation at the root of those conditions and as a significant source of Black rage in Black communities, the Commission's findings called for historic changes to American housing policy. A landmark Supreme Court case, Jones versus Mayer, decided just weeks after the passage of the Fair Housing Act in the spring of 1968, drew upon the 1866 Civil Rights Act and the 13th Amendment in comparing housing segregation to slavery. The decision argued in part, quote, "When racial discrimination herds men into ghettos and makes their ability to buy property turn on the color of their skin, then it is a relic of slavery." The final piece of the battle to open the U.S. housing market to African Americans came with the Housing and Urban Development Act in August of 1968. The 1968 HUD Act was Lyndon Johnson's last greatest legislative accomplishment. It was a bill planned in collaboration with representatives from private enterprise and what was known as the Kaiser Commission. Yes, that Kaiser. The businessmen who participated described their promotion of single-family homeownership for poor people as socio-commercial enterprise, or business with a conscience. Johnson described the legislation as the Magna Carta for the cities, and its focus on the market and ownership ensured that it was a bipartisan bill. For decades, federal officials had relied upon public housing to shelter poor and low-income people. But by the end of the 1960s, public housing had become politically untenable with endless jousts over its maintenance, location, and inhabitants. Housing for the poor suffered from a mixture of government neglect and shrinking tenancy, a result of the dangerous conditions endured by residents and the constant pressure for such housing to exclude anyone other than the poorest tenants. The HUD Act was a pivot away from the notion of public or state responsibility for housing the poor or low income. At the heart of the legislation was a low-income homeownership plan that aimed to transform low-income renters into low-income homeowners. Federal officials turned to homeownership as a cheaper program where the costs of the houses were absorbed by the program participants while the federal government paid regular subsidies to banks, which kept the state's cost lower than the upfront expenses necessary to develop, build, and manage public housing. These economic concerns also fit with the growing idea that homeownership could stabilize the anger and restiveness coursing through American cities. Freshman Senator Charles H. Percy, a Republican from Illinois, described the benefits of expanding homeownership as, quote, "a new dawn of opportunity on which a new national effort to bring dignity and a better life to today's slum dwellers must be based. We can democratize our cities," he continued. "We can give people of the ghetto a piece of the action, let them be somebody, and achieve something." President Richard Nixon said of the bill, quote, "People who own their own homes don't burn down their neighborhoods. Whether in pride and self-interest, they turn to fixing up their communities and making them livable for themselves and their neighbors." The terms of the new homeownership program were a low $200 down payment, 20% of a participant's income as their mortgage, regardless of the cost of the house, and interest rates that were capped at 1%. The inclusion of federal mortgage insurance from the Federal Housing Administration for the first time meant that in the worst case scenario, a foreclosure or abandonment, the federal government was obligated to step in and pay back the mortgage to the lenders. These terms kept the price of the homes manageable for low-income and working-class people. But it also removed almost all of the risk for the real estate industry. As one official described the program, quote, "It's like doing business in heaven. You can't lose money." The unprecedented program linked federal agencies to real estate brokers and mortgage bankers to supply the loans and the housing loans and loans to people in neighborhoods that these organizations had previously excluded or redlined. But with the promise of lucrative subsidies and the guarantees of mortgage insurance and the promise of profit that came with them, the historic hostility of these private sector forces melted away. But these same conditions also open new pathways for corrupt real estate practices. Speculators and brokers bought up cheap, dilapidated properties, hoping to flip them for higher prices and sales to people who would qualify for the programs. The entirety of the program was in the hands of real estate operatives. HUD sent brokers lists of eligible properties. When a real estate broker matched a person with a house, they connected the prospective buyer with a mortgage lender. The mortgage lender consulted with HUD to determine if the person qualified for the program. At no time did an individual speak with a representative of the federal government. Not only could money be made by flipping cheap properties, but brokers also found it easy to bribe poorly paid FHA appraisers into inflating the value of the houses in this new urban market. Bankers made money on the front end of the real estate deal by securing the loan in the first place, and then they made money on the back end deal with expensive closing costs associated with selling the property. Everyone made money, except the poor black families that were disproportionately saddled with these broken homes across the country. The federal government's turn to home ownership was also a consummate expression of post-war racial liberalism, which viewed inclusion into American democracy through the vehicles of citizenship, law, and free market capitalism as the key to unlocking equality and social mobility for black citizens, just as it had done for white Americans through the New Deal and the GI Bill after World War II. But in narrowing their focus to access alone, racial liberals overlooked the racist practices embedded within those institutions. This was shockingly clear in the real estate industry. Banks and real estate had played the central role in creating the urban housing crisis, exemplified by the persistence of rats in black housing. So the sudden involvement of the same private sector forces was a recipe for disaster. This obviously did not mean that African Americans should continue to be excluded. Rather, it demanded greater scrutiny, greater enforcement of rules regarding the protection of civil rights, and specific plans to undo the practices that had resulted in black exclusion in the first place. Without that level of scrutiny and the threat of behavior-altering punishment, there was nothing in place to prevent the continuation of those practices. Instead of scrutiny and regulation, predatory practices continued, though. In other words, the racist exclusion of African Americans gave way to their predatory inclusion. The notion of risk facilitated the charade of race neutrality as the neighborhood conditions and financial insecurity of African Americans that had been created by the racist actions and behavior of government agencies, bankers, and real estate brokers were now twisted into evidence that black people should be treated cautiously within the marketplace. Predatory inclusion described the different, more expensive, and ultimately exploitative terms upon which African Americans were admitted into the world of conventional real estate practices under the guise of colorblind neutrality. In reality, decades of color-conscious exclusion created poverty and the conditions of dilapidation and deterioration in working class and poor black communities that then became the visual evidence, the proof that these neighborhoods, and most importantly, the people who lived in these neighborhoods, posed a risk to property values and loan repayment. More generally, predatory inclusion described the ways that African Americans were welcomed into institutions and practices from which they had formerly been excluded, because there were new, supposedly colorblind ways in which they could be extracted from or financially exploited. In the supposed colorblind, race-neutral American marketplace, black investment in the housing market could result in a credit-shattering, insurmountable debt with no hopes of their homes gaining value over time. This, of course, did not mean that the homes of black people had no value. Black housing, even in its greatest distress, could be fortresses of refuge, places of communion, sites of connection, but rarely was it the financial asset that it had been for millions of white people. But it was this issue of value that so much of the housing market turned on. The key to the American dream of homeownership was not just the simple possession of property, but just as important was whether the value of that property would rise over time, increasing the owner's equity. In a society with an anemic social welfare state, the boost in home values were determinative of one's quality of life. The ascending value of a home could help finance a college education, an unforeseen financial crisis, or contribute to a comfortable retirement. But homes did not ascend or descend in value on their own terms. The surrounding neighborhood and the value or lack of value of the other buildings, businesses, and institutions helped determine whether a neighborhood was good or bad. In the United States, value was also shaped by whether a property owner was white or black, surrounded by other white people or surrounded by black people. There is a perception in our society that value is intrinsic, tangible, real. We know what has value when we see it, just as clearly as we understand the lack of value when we see it. But in this way, value within the housing market is socially constructed, a strange alchemy of race, place, and the perceptions of the buying public. Or as sociologist Dalton Conley put it, property values are where culture meets economics. Frederick M. Babcock, considered an originator of real estate appraisal, wrote in his seminal book, The Appraisal of Real Estate, quote, "It is obvious that there is no absolute ironclad method of computing real estate values, because values are a social phenomenon dependent upon human behavior. The intensely subjective process of determining the value of property or a neighborhood, the pseudoscience of real estate appraisal, was inherently informed by the presence or absence of African Americans. The American Institute of Real Estate Appraisers said as much when its professional manual maintained, quote, the clash of nationalities with dissimilar cultures contributes to the destruction of value. When a new class of people of a different race, color, nationality, and culture move into a neighborhood, old inhabitants think that their neighborhood is losing desirability. Thus, the intensity of anti-black racism in American society was inevitably wound into these notions of property value, neighborhood, and community value. The assumption that African Americans were harmful to property values drove the desire to keep them segregated. It justified their marginalization in the housing market. It offered a common sense explanation for the disproportionate conditions of dilapidation, distress, and substandard housing largely owned by whites and rented to African Americans. The difference in value in white housing compared to black housing produced a tension between exchange value and use value in housing, or more intimately, the difference between real estate and a home. These contradictory objectives of real estate and a home, one a commodity and the other intimating a place of belonging, also reinforced reactionary racial norms and deepened the perception of dual housing markets working at dual purposes. Mid-century narratives of normative whiteness embodied in conceptions of the suburban-based nuclear family shaped the perceptions of home as an expression of use value within white communities. Conversely, developing narratives concerning the perceived domestic dysfunction within black living spaces whether non-normative family formations or poverty or dilapidated living structures, cast black dwellings as incapable of achieving the status of home, thus reducing them to their base exchange value. Where white housing was seen as an asset developed through inclusion and the accruable possibilities of its surrounding property, black housing was marked by its exclusion and isolation, where value was extracted, not imbued. These racialized narratives of family, communities, and their built environments reinforced and naturalized the segregative practices among real estate brokers, mortgage bankers, and the white public. Indeed, these perceptions of insurmountable difference, steeped in the permanence of blood, race, and culture, constituted the underwriting criteria that determined who was to be excluded and who should be included. In this way, segregation was profitable. Value accrued to white housing the further it was from African Americans and their neighborhoods. But value could also be found in segregated and distressed housing for black people. Only the value did not flow to black homeowners or black owners. Black people functioned as vessels through which capital flowed from enclosed black neighborhoods out to banks and real estate operatives. Real estate operatives confined each group to its own section of a single housing market to preserve the allure of exclusivity for whites while satisfying the demand of housing for African Americans. This was not evidence of a dual housing market, but a single American market that tied race to risk, linking both to the rise and fall of property values and generating profits that grew into the sinew that bound it all together. White housing and white neighborhoods did well because black housing and black neighborhoods were robbed of federal subsidies and guarantees. A white housing market would have actually been unintelligible without its black counterpart. Both relied on the other to make each legible. This reality exposed the thinness of American liberalism, where inclusion alone was offered as a palliative to the rigid structures of white supremacy that held the market together, the governing institutions, and the law itself. The collusive relationship between the public and private sector and the production of public policy, housing policy, undermined the potential for inclusion to make meaning of black citizenship. These limits became starkly clear with the new Housing and Urban Development Act in 1968. Consider the experience of Janice Johnson. On September 18, 1970, Janice Johnson bought her first home in Philadelphia with a mortgage guaranteed by the Federal Housing Administration. By all previous standards, Johnson was an atypical buyer. She was a black single mother on welfare living with her 8-year-old son in a decaying apartment in a building that had recently been condemned. Now facing eviction, Johnson needed to quickly find a new place to live. When she found an apartment for rent in the same neighborhood, Johnson called the landlord in anticipation, but her hopes were dashed when he told her that she could not rent the apartment because she was a welfare recipient. The landlord, however, quickly pivoted from offering her a rental to suggesting that Janice Johnson buy a house in the same neighborhood. As a welfare recipient, she qualified for one of HUD's new low-income homeownership programs. And within a matter of weeks, she was able to purchase a new home with an FHA-backed loan for $5,600. Within weeks, though, Janice Johnson realized that her home was not the fulfillment of the American dream. It was the beginning of her American nightmare. Within days of moving into her new house, the sewer line broke, spewing wastewater all over the basement floor. The electricity for the house was sporadic and haphazard. There were holes and other irregularities in the foundation of the home. The compromised structure of the house was not the worst of it. On Halloween night, Johnson's son, Edward, woke up to find a rat in his bed. Janice Johnson saw rats throughout her house, including in the kitchen and bathroom. She called the agent who sold her the house to complain about its condition. He sent workmen out on a couple of occasions, and they even patched the failing plaster in her dining room. But soon after, the real estate agent reminded her that the problems in her house were now her own. They were what he described as homeowners' business. Miserable and dangerous housing conditions in the existing urban market led people to walk away from their homes that had been recently purchased, and the number of defaults, foreclosures, and FHA insurance payments began to rise. By the end of 1973, 10% of Section 235 homes were in foreclosure, along with tens of thousands of other homes in FHA-assisted low-income homeownership programs. In May of 1974, HUD was in possession of 78,000 single-family homes that had been foreclosed through these programs. Indeed, congressional investigations into impropriety in the homeownership programs showed that federal appraisers were taking bribes and inflating the value of dilapidated houses by 3 or 4 times their actual worth. Local mortgage bankers were also accused of accepting bribes to ignore inconsistencies in paperwork that was needed to authorize the purchase and sale of a particular house. Newspaper reports and hundreds of federal indictments identified local FHA officials, appraisers, real estate agents, and mortgage lenders as all involved in the swindle. These were not only scandals, but crimes that had been committed against poor and working class black people. In cities as diverse as Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Seattle, San Jose, California, Columbia, South Carolina, and beyond, real estate brokers, FHA officials, mortgage bankers were arrested and indicted for a criminal conspiracy to commit fraud. By the end of 1974, the FBI had almost 2,000 active investigations open into more claims of fraud related to these programs. The crises in the programs coincided with an end to the long post-war economic boom that had been the foundation of the American dream. Instead, by the end of 1973, unemployment was on the rise, as was inflation, creating the economic conundrum of stagflation. The onset of recession, the deepest since the 1930s, created a political opportunity to roll these programs back by stoking the racial resentment of white suburbanites and the perception that these programs were for undeserving African Americans. This opportunity helped shape the political climate that allowed the Nixon administration to implement their long-held plan to shift power back to the states when it came to the distribution of social welfare. The overriding objective was to unravel the Johnson welfare state and replace it with revenue sharing, block grants, and a devolved role of the federal government while promoting an agenda of local control of the distribution of social welfare funds for cities and states. While there had been bipartisan support for low-income homeownership, the mounting scandals were becoming a political problem. Advocates or other elected officials also argued that there should be less emphasis on existing housing and more of a focus on building new homes in cities to give African Americans more, better, and cheaper housing options. This was certainly not in Nixon's plans, not after he had carefully cultivated the white silent majority coalition made up of disaffected white suburbanites who fought to keep their communities exclusive. The growing spectacle of scandal and mounting foreclosures within the HUD homeownership programs generated the momentum for the right to attack housing policies. The political attacks were, of course, not confined to housing, but the entire social welfare state came into question. These programs had been won largely in part due to the insurgent black movement that helped to redefine black poverty and inequality to the exclusive policies of the state, rampant discrimination, and capitalism itself. From the March on Washington's insistence on freedom and jobs, to Malcolm X's link between capitalism and racism, to Stokely Carmichael coining the phrase institutional racism, and the Black Panther Party's anti-capitalist, anti-colonial framing, the movement had clearly identified the foundation of Black inequality, and more importantly, the need for programs that address structural inequality. To effectively undermine these programs, then, the right attacked the participants as undeserving, ungrateful, and ultimately untrustworthy. For the HUD homeownership program, this meant demonizing the poorest of the program participants as undeserving recipients of HUD subsidies and mortgage guarantees. The effort to encourage low-income homeownership among African Americans was castigated as a bizarre and naive experiment in social engineering. As an Ohio Congressman, Tom Ashley, tartly argued, "You cannot run a middle-class program in the ghetto." Members of Congress and news reporters turned their attention to the poorest participants in the program, Black women on welfare who had been aggressively targeted to become homeowners. These women, many of whom had been recruited from deteriorating public housing complexes, were particularly vulnerable to buying homes that were in poor condition because they were desperate for housing for themselves and their children. But when questions surfaced about the condition of their housing as an act of self-preservation, HUD investigators linked the distressed housing to the homemaking skills of Black women, like Janice Johnson. In one hearing in 1970 to discuss the growing problems in the home ownership programs, George Romney, who was Secretary of HUD, appointed by Nixon in 1969, heralded as one of the last great racial liberals of the Republican Party, complained, quote, "In the case of lower income families, you have many who have not had the responsibility of home ownership previously, and therefore there is a greater tendency on their part to not undertake the work necessary to maintain a home." Some officials were even more explicit in their attacks. Georgia Congressman Ben Blackburn argued, quote, "The problem is that we have been putting families into homes who have no sense of responsibility of home ownership, and that is where the problem has been, and that is the intrinsic problem in the program. Is that not true? We found welfare mothers whose sole income was aid for dependent children, plus other benefits that come from that status in life. And they were put in housing, presumably as owners, yet they could not even fix a faucet washer. Have we not concluded that there are some people who should not be in the status of home purchasers?" Of course, there was the undeniable irony of the rich white men of Congress who relied upon Black women as maids and caretakers for their families, now complaining about their homemaking skills. But there was a larger issue. Focusing on Black women's housekeeping abilities deflected attention from the more pressing question of why the FHA was insuring properties in uninhabitable condition. After all, an earlier audit of HUD's homeownership program concluded, quote, no homeowner can be expected to cope with poor construction, cracked foundations, improper wiring, and a general failure of contractors to meet local building and maintenance requirements. It is important to say that Black women were not just victims of this kind of abuse, and it was really their willingness to seek out help and use the resources of legal aid to engage in litigation that the criminal aspects of these programs came to light. By the mid-70s, especially in Philadelphia, Black women were at the helm of important grassroots organizing efforts to make HUD and FHA fulfill their promises to repair the broken houses that had been sold to them on the watch of those organizations. Other activists also rejected this kind of victim blaming. One homeowner turned activist from Chicago described the devastating effects of HUD's failed programs as, quote, "The outright murder of our neighborhoods in America, aided and abetted by the Federal Housing Administration, the mortgage industry, the insurance industry, and the unscrupulous real estate industry. These four institutions are working together to systematically destroy what's left of America's cities. What for so long has been considered a natural phenomenon, changing neighborhoods, deteriorating cities, are not natural. It's an outright plan, and the government, the realtors and the big money people are making a lot of money out of changing neighborhoods, out of the communities that we call home. Nixon officials, nevertheless, were able to use the spectacular fraud and corruption of HUD's homeownership programs as evidence that the government should get out of the business of housing poor and low-income people. The highly visible collapse of the low-income homeownership programs not only raised questions about the role of the state in housing people, but it also allowed officials to gain support for keeping poor and working-class black people out of white suburban communities. In January of 1973, in his last act as HUD secretary, George Romney announced a national moratorium on the construction or funding of all federal subsidized housing programs, including all of the FHA-assisted low-income homeownership programs. Months later, Nixon would tell Congress, quote, "All across America, the federal government has become the biggest slumlord in history. Leaders of all political persuasions and from all levels of government agreed that the federally subsidized housing approach has failed." Instead, Nixon suggested, quote, "Of the policy alternatives available, the most promising way to achieve decent housing for all of our families at an acceptable cost appears to be direct cash assistance." This was the beginning of the federal turn to Section 8 housing vouchers, first issued in 1974. The introduction of vouchers was coupled with the demand from the Nixon administration that the existing housing stock be utilized for low-income building. Existing housing was understood to be in cities, further cementing the racial division in low-income housing. Meanwhile, the Nixon administration secured $3 billion for the construction of new low-income homes that were all but guaranteed to be built in suburbs and largely reserved for white residents. With existing housing in the cities for black renters and new construction in the suburbs for white buyers, Nixon's segregated vision for housing in the United States was fulfilled. In closing, when Ronald Reagan became president in 1980, he called for HUD to convene a special commission on housing policy. For more than 30 years after pledging to provide decent homes for all of its citizens, the federal government and its Department of Housing continued to fail in the achievement of its goal. The latest Housing Commission, paneled by Reagan in 1982, called its report "To House a Nation," and it began with a criticism of the 1968 HUD Act. The 1968 HUD Act had left as its legacy, quote, "a belief in the potency of government programs." Reagan's Commission on Housing promised the opposite, quote, "The genius of the market economy, freed from the distortions of government housing policies and regulations that swung erratically from loving to hostile, can provide for housing far better than federal programs." It was a conclusion that could only be reached by ignoring the actual origins of the HUD Act and the reasons behind its demise. Lyndon Johnson had also promised to unleash, quote, "the genius of private industry" as the key to unlocking the mystery of perpetual housing crises. But lackadaisical management, erratic regulations, and trenchant racial discrimination, combined with the end of redlining and the predacious inclusion of formerly excluded black urbanites, allowed the real estate industry to bleed the inner city dry. It was not government intrusion that sank the FHA-assisted low-income homeownership programs. It was government negligence. But this malfeasance was not just an issue of poorly motivated personnel. It was the outcome of mismatched objectives and impossible tasks. When public policies are guided by the objectives of private enterprise, as the HUD homeownership programs undoubtedly were, they are clenched in a dance of conflict. As magnanimous as the titans of business who argued for so-called socio-commercial enterprise in the 1960s tried to present themselves, in the end, the objective of profit-making outpaced the necessity for safe and sound housing. One glaring reason for this spoke to the heart of the conflict. Real estate profits were rooted in residential segregation. Race was turned into profit. There is a tendency to view the post-riot city as trapped in the stasis of blight, and the inevitability of decay over time. The late 1960s and 1970s were defined by changing political, social, and economic dynamics, however, and the inner city was at the nexus of these processes. New financial instruments, such as mortgage-backed securities, produced an intense national demand for more homeowners and more money for home financing, while lax oversight and regulation incentivized unscrupulous and predatory targeting of urban communities. Far from being a static site of dilapidation and ruin, the urban core was becoming an attractive place of unparalleled opportunity, a new frontier of economic investment and extraction for the banking and real estate industries. The race for profit in the 1970s transformed blighted urban space into what one U.S. Senator, Walter Mondale, described as, quote, a golden ghetto, where profits for banks and real estate brokers were never ending, and shattered credit and ruined neighborhoods were all that remained for black people who lived there. But these are not just important historical lessons. They have a direct bearing on the communities and neighborhoods we live in today. Housing policy over much of the 20th century, and certainly the housing crisis of the 1970s, contributed to the uneven development of black urban and suburban communities compared to white urban and suburban communities. The geographic scars created by the HUD FHA crisis in the 1970s, where nearly 80,000 single-family homes were repossessed, but hundreds of thousands of more multifamily unit buildings also went into foreclosure, exacerbated a crisis of abandonment that animated the optics of distress and dilapidation. A generation later, these conditions became the basis for designating a place and the people who lived there as subprime. For more than 50 years now, the private sector has been viewed as the most capable of ending the persisting housing crisis. And yet those crises have become even starker over time, creating even greater degrees of housing precariousness. This is especially true in the realm of home ownership. The acceleration of subprime lending in the atmosphere of deregulation in the late 1990s and early 2000s resulted in unprecedented home losses for African Americans. The practice of subprime lending was contingent on racial practices and assumptions across the housing industry and among the general public. The cascade of foreclosures and mortgage defaults further eroded the value of properties in black communities, once again hollowing out the notion of homes as assets for African Americans. The net loss of more than 240,000 homes for black people has created the pretext for mortgage lenders to once again engage in exclusionary practices that marginalize potential black homeowners. But this is only one aspect of the crisis. The recurring perception of risky black buyers has opened pathways for the reemergence of naked predatory practices in the real estate market. From rent-to-own schemes to the reappearance of land installment contracts in lieu of conventional mortgages, real estate continues to pilfer African Americans in search of their American dream in the housing market. It is not history repeating itself. It is the predictable outcome when the home is a commodity and it continues to be promoted as the fulfillment and meaning of citizenship. Thank you.
Happy to take questions, but can we pass around, do you have the microphone there? It's at the podium. Oh, this one here, you mean? Underneath. No, there's no. We're missing a.
Oh, no.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So, just make sure that you, for recording purposes, you want to be recording. You use the microphone. Questions, please.
Yeah.
Do you mind passing? It's a bit laborious, I know. Would you pass it back?
Just keep passing it back. 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 Success.
Thank you for that wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
I have read that the Jews, the Italians, and the Irish all became white when it was advantageous for Robert Moses to break up their communities and send them out to the suburbs.
Right.
I'm wondering, in hearing this, and I'm reminded the old Nixon expression, would you buy a used car from that person? In this case, would you buy a used house? And I'm wondering whether there's any way to incentivize the real estate industry, short of just nationalizing it.
To incentivize them
to stop this racial segregation in the same way that, the Irish suddenly became white. That sort of question.
I mean, private property is the sanctity, lifeblood, the meaning of human existence in the United States. And so the idea that the federal government would ever step in such a way to create those sorts of conditions, I think is deeply unlikely. So much so that even, Baltimore was the first city to impose what was then nakedly racial zoning, right? Like the city said black people can only buy property and live on this block. White people can only buy property and live on this block. It was a step even further than just simple residential segregation. And even then, the Supreme Court stepped in and said, you can't do that. You can't interfere with the market in such a direct and specific way. And so I think, the sanctity of private property really prevents that. And I think we can see that even in the kind of complete lackadaisical way that fair housing is imposed or not imposed. I mean, when the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, it immediately created a civil rights division within HUD that was supposed to be empowered to now enforce this new anti-housing discrimination legislation. And so in its first year, where its appropriations were likely to be the highest, it was given $1 million for $5 million of which was supposed to go to staffing and setting up the office, which left $1 million, or it was given $6 million. $5 million for staffing, left $1 million for actual implementation of the policy for 120 people. So $1 million for 120 people to investigate all claims of racial discrimination in housing in the United States of America. So that shows on its face a complete lack of commitment to that idea. And then we can see in the 50 years, since the Fair Housing Act is all but an afterthought. And so that, I think that's part of the problem. It raises much larger questions about the nature of our society, the emphasis and focus on, home ownership and ownership of property in the first place as a means to improving one's quality of life as opposed to state-enacted programs. So no.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I thought since the mic was on this end, I'd go ahead and
Take
be
advantage.
second when I didn't plan on. When I first moved to the Bay Area, I met a black guy in West Oakland who became a friend of mine. And so when I bought a car in the Bay Area, I asked him for, what's your auto insurance company? And he said, oh, I've got a good one. And this is the one you should get. And I don't remember the name, but that's what he recommended. So I went to an auto insurance broker. And by the way, I live in the Elmwood Rock Ridge district near College Avenue. I don't know if you know where that is, but
No.
people here will know that that's a very affluent, for better or worse, socially worse, in my case, 99.9% residentially white area. But I moved there to be close to the university. So I went to the insurance broker and I told him, yeah, this friend of mine told me I should ask for this insurance. And the insurance broker, actually who was black, said, oh no, that's not the insurance for you. This is the insurance for you, implying that I was going to get a much better deal because I lived in the Elmwood Rock Ridge district. And this really sort of emphasized to me, for the first time, even though I knew it before, that there is a two-track economic system, one for black and brown people and the other for white people. So my question is, whether white homeowners are racist or not, when real estate companies blockbust, move those first black families into that previously all-white neighborhood, the perceived economic decline in the value of a white person's home may actually be real and not imagined, because if banks engage in home improvement redlining and other forms of redlining, their property is actually going to suffer a loss, whether or not they are real. I saw a city, I saw a neighborhood in one city, a middle-class black neighborhood, where the homes were, well kept and middle class, but strangely the garages behind the homes were dilapidated or weather-worn or even had been torn down. And I don't know what the reason of that is, but I thought, this is probably home loan insurance, home improvement insurance redlining. And the last thing I'll say, the PBS NewsHour, it's typical mainstream news, but they ran a pretty good series on black home ownership and things like home improvement loan redlining. And it showed a black woman with a steady good job for decades who couldn't get a home improvement loan to fix her water heater.
Yep.
But she turned, since her neighborhood was starting to be gentrified, she turned to a white friend of hers who the bank said had to co-sign for her, who had a part-time job,
Yep.
and hadn't worked I don't think she'd worked even 5 years at that point. And another case where there was an Asian woman with a part-time job who had to co-sign for a black woman who had a good job
Philly. Yeah.
to get the loan. So you may specifically know of that. But so I just want to ask you, whether white people are racist or not, their homes under these conditions are actually declining in value.
Yeah, those are the case in Philadelphia is a black woman. This was a lesbian couple, and it was a black woman and her Asian American partner. And the black woman had a professional job at the University of Pennsylvania. She was like the director of technology or something like that. And the bank would not extend her a home loan. And so they would only, she went to 3 or 4 different mortgage brokers. No one would give her a loan. And finally, one of them suggested that her partner, who was a part-time clerk at like Whole Foods, come in and co-sign for her before they would approve the loan. And so this was actually part of a story. I don't know if any of you have read or heard of the book Home Wreckers. Aaron Glantz, who's a reporter with the Reveal News site, they did a big investigative journalist piece about redlining in Philly, and found since the financial crisis in 2008, it has become exceedingly difficult for African Americans to get home loans in the city of Philadelphia. And this case was highlighted as the most kind of absurd example of that. I think generally one historical thing that I don't think that people think about when it comes to redlining, which is that not only were African Americans excluded from this FHA insurance, which allowed banks to kind of lend freely and without hesitation, but they were also excluded from home repair loans as well, which meant that the properties in black neighborhoods in cities were particularly distressed, because not only were they older and had gone through the cycle of, successive waves of immigrants, and then they had been chopped up for African American migrants coming into cities who were segregated. Landlords knew that, didn't do repairs, and overcrowded the living spaces. But then there was no access to small repair home loan grants, which would allow people to maintain, do basic maintenance and maintain their properties over a long period of time. And the consequences of those historical policies have a cumulative impact over time, where people, still live in these communities. In the city of Philadelphia, where I live, the housing is old in cities. I mean, you have houses that are more than 100 years old that are still being used by people, that are still being rented and purchased by people. So there's a cumulative impact to these policies that we think of as historical. And then I guess the last point about declining value, I think that there are some examples, and they're very far and few between, where white people didn't move, and it actually the property value issue stabilized as a result. There's Oak Park, Illinois. There's the neighborhood that I live in now, Mount Airy, Philadelphia, which is in the northwest of the city. And I think that those are important examples. But the larger point is that the collusion between state actors and the private sector work together to create that dynamic of declining property values. I think my point is that it's not intrinsic to the presence of black people. It's not something that black people radiate, but that it shows the kind of the way that the market is not just this kind of detached, colorblind, disinterested space, but that the market is us, and in some sense, at Berkeley, at Santa Cruz, it's like, well, yeah, that's common sense, but there is the perception in our wider society, which is, why the federal government can consistently, and state actors can consistently call on the private enterprise and the market, because the market is supposed to be this place that only cares about money, that only is ruled by supply and demand. And part of what I'm trying to do with my book is, in this historical example, is say that no, that it's not some weird colorblind space, but that the market is a reflection of the values of a society, which are deeply shaped and influenced by public and private sector forces, most pronouncedly by the private sector, which is why, if we want to seriously engage and deal with the perpetual cycle of what are called housing crises, but I said in one interview, if this is the state of things over the last 100 years, when does it cease being a crisis and kind of a chronic feature of our society, housing insecurity? Then we have to get the market, we have to get the private sector out of the distribution of housing for most people. Let's go to this side of the room. Yes, you.
Hi, Dr. Taylor. I'm really excited that you're here talking about race for profit, not only because it's relevant and readable, but also because of the way that you underscore the centrality and importance of poor black women in fighting against and exposing the low-income home ownership programs. And we see that legacy still today in Oakland with Moms for Housing. Yeah. If y'all don't know about it, definitely check it out. And seeing how poor black mothers are leading this burgeoning movement of declaring housing as a human right. Yeah. And so in the case of Moms for Housing, we saw how the Alameda County Sheriff's Office deployed officers with tanks and military gear and AR-15s to evict Black mothers and children from a vacant home
Yep.
to protect corporate interests. So I just wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about how policing, or the police as a state apparatus, is relevant and a part of and plays a role in the history of housing and segregation in the U.S.
I mean, to me, that speaks to the issue that I was first talking about, which is the sanctity of private property. I mean, if you need to evict, you know, a couple of families that are living in a house with military, an arsenal, with, you know, SWAT gear, tanks, you know, that shows you something or says something about the importance of private property in our society. And it says something about the complicity of the state in underlining that. Because if anyone thought that the police or even the state itself were some kind of neutral body that is just here to, you know, make sure that society functions, there are very, you know, periodically you get very clear examples that shatter that illusion. And the role of the police and the role of the state in evictions is the clearest example of that. Because on one hand, you could say, what on earth does the state have any role in removing people from this dispute between the, you know, inhabitants of a privately owned property? That's a dispute between two people that should have nothing to do with the state. But the state regularly, as a course of law, intervenes on behalf of property owners to remove members of the public body. And so it demonstrates the extent to which the state is implicated in the preservation of the sanctity of private property. And I think that, you know, that has obviously been a historic role, and I think it points back to really two things. One is the question of what we do in the here and now, so the question of reform and how ordinary people develop the capacity to challenge the state and capital in terms of preserving a space for the right to live somewhere, for the right to housing. And so that can look like the type of organizing that Moms for Housing have undertaken. It can look like the rent riots of the 1930s. It can look like the formation of tenant unions in the 1960s. In Chicago, tenant unions wasn't just a metaphorical phrase. Tenants were actually able to force landlords into collective bargaining agreements around the conditions of housing that were enforceable in courts. And so there's that issue, and then there is the larger systemic questions about what it means to be in a society where private property is more important than human life. And I think that is clearly the case in this country, where, you know, whether it's San Francisco or New York, where you have the $1 million homes that are really just there for rich people to stash their money, while tens of thousands, not hyperbolically speaking, but literally tens of thousands of people are living on the street. And so that gets to the question of what does it mean to undertake a more transformative set of political actions to make human life more important than private property. And that gets into questions about the nature of our society.
Thank
David?
you.
Thank you. It was a fantastic talk.
Thank you.
Maybe on that last note, I agree with you, like structural change, societal change, but you're also pointing to the need for cultural transformation. So meaning, what would it look like for the sanctification You have the sanctity of private property, but the sanctification of something like public housing. So where all those strategies you're talking about move us there, but even the political action doesn't get us quite to cultural transformation. And I'm curious about what kind of indices that you could see or suggest that might augur some kind of cultural transformation, such that it's a viable alternative to the sanctity of private property.
I think that we're seeing some of that now. I think that for a long time, people have just assumed that the U.S. just isn't that kind of place. We can't talk about universal health care, and we can't possibly talk about free college, and we certainly can't talk about public housing. And I think that we've reached a point where the cheerleaders for the market the solutions that they offer have failed. And so it means that there is, it doesn't mean that the counter argument to that automatically succeeds, but it means that there is an opening for it. If we've had, 40 years, even if you just look at from the collapse of the Berlin Wall, when the neoliberals announced that capitalism was the end of history, there is no alternative. And what we've seen since that, is market failure after market failure in the lives of ordinary people. Not for them, the rich have never been richer. They're doing better than they've done in history. But for the majority of people, this has failed, and most people are looking at a life full of debt, a lifetime of debt, this debt tumor that we all sort of walk around with, that you'll never be able to pay off. It's set up so that you can't pay it off. Right. You can't pay, large portions of it. You either pay the whole thing or they nickel and dime you to death. You can see I'm particularly bitter about this, and so it means that people are open to an alternative. And there's no other way to explain how, if you know anything about the history of the United States and the insane anti-communism, the insane history of anti-socialism, and that a socialist is a leading contender for the Democratic Party's nomination, tells you all you need to know about the failures of capitalism in the United States. But at the same time, I think the best characterization of the U.S. is that it's incredibly polarized. It's the growth of the left, but it's also the growth of the right. And each side will vie for their explanation of things. The right wants to tell us that it's the immigrants, it's the black people, it's the Muslims, they're the problem. If we get rid of them, life will be great. We'll make America great again. And the left has a different set of explanations that talk about the reestablishment of a public sector, of a commons. Yep. And, I think that actually resonates with people, so that if you talk about public housing and building 10 million units of social housing in this country, that people don't look at you like you have 6 heads anymore. It's more like, well, how are we going to do that? And so I think that is part of is part of some process of the transformation of a political culture that even allows for that kind of discussion. Being able to build upon that and to fulfill that, I think, requires more than just an opening. It requires organization and politics and an analysis that is relentless in fighting for a different vision, a reimagination in a literal sense of our society. And it's part of what makes politics particularly exciting right now. Yeah.
First off, I think you're really great.
Thank you.
I was wondering, Sylvia Federici talks about like the breaking up of the enclosures, and the UK as a transition to private property. I was thinking while you were talking, did you find anything in your research that has a corollary to that in the United States? Was there any type of commons that we can think of in that sense for Black folks in the US? And then the follow-up question would be, if there's not, is the reasoning for that because of the way that capitalism was created in the US specifically versus a switch from feudalism?
I think that maybe there are two ways to think about that. One, I think that probably the closest comparison we could look at is what happens in the aftermath of slavery. So in the South, actually during slavery, there was a way that planters allowed for poor whites to have access to their land. And so it's not quite a commons because it was privately owned property, but there, as a way of kind of managing tensions in the South, there was a way that poor white people could access the land of planters. And one of the things that happens at the end of slavery, much more contested as real estate and other private sector forces want to close off any competition with the market, especially as the post-war economic expansion continues. And so this is an example of the potential for a public space that is repeatedly undermined until you get to the late 1960s and 1970s, and it has become it's almost completely collapsed. And so really, I think that is those are two pretty sparse examples, because I think that this is a country founded on settler colonialism, and the settlement and theft of land was a strategy that was used to manage class tensions in the U.S. on the one hand, and to put facts on the ground, and to create this nation state. And so I think there's a different relationship to privatism and to private property that has its own particular and unique history. What do we have for time?
Can you take a couple more?
Yeah.
You good to go?
Yeah. Let's take one more. I feel like I've been talking for 36 hours. Yeah.
I don't know if I'm supposed
Yes.
to do the. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I really am grateful I'm grateful that I had a chance to hear that talk. So thank you. One question I have, and you just brought up settler colonialism,
Yep.
is what is the relationship to indigenous people and Native people in thinking about collective futures of a public and public housing, and kind of ensuring like this kind of desperation we see in the Bay Area, where just this homeless population is just exploding. How do we come into relationship with Native people to think through possible futures?
I think that there's a lot to look at in the last couple of years about one of the things that I was talking about earlier, which is what are the types of campaigns and political mobilizations that are necessary in this moment. And so there's the larger long-term issue about the transforming the relationship to, how we see private property. And then there's the immediate issue of how do we house people, and how do we deal with the urgency of that question. And so I think that there are a number of political struggles that Native people have been obviously central to, probably most pronouncedly the pipeline struggles that point to the importance of direct action, that point to the importance of solidarity, and that point to, I think, the possibility of what can happen in these moments of collective endeavoring. And so I think that we have a lot to learn from different sectors of organizing. I think that now is a moment, the moment of political possibility that I was talking about is also a moment of learning from each other's histories, learning from each other's struggles, and figuring out what are the points of connection, What are the points for the possibility of unity, for, not trying to reduce all of our situations into a single narrative, because I think, people are affected and impacted by oppression and exploitation in different ways. But what are the points of connection, and what are where are the bases upon which we can unite for the imagination of a different kind of society? So I think, that's kind of where I'm at with some of these questions. But I think that we're in a moment of immense possibility right now, and that's exciting. Thank you, guys.